Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Alejandro Frangi from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of in-silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into how we can, make sure all those cool new technologies we hear about, like quantum computing, even gene editing, actually have a chance to, thrive. Sometimes it feels like, rules and regs can kind of get in the way.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely, it's a balance. Want to encourage innovation, but also, make sure things are done well, safely and responsibly.
Right, exactly. And that's where this report you gave me comes in, right? Proportionate and Adaptive Governance of Innovative Technologies. PAGIT, bit of a mouthful. But the idea is pretty straightforward, I think.
Yeah, it is. Basically, it's about finding ways to govern these new technologies, smarter ways, flexible ways.
I like it already. Okay, so before we get into all the details of PAGIT, can you give us some context? Like the report mentions that past governance choices haven't always been ideal.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes it's been like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The rules, they might have been made with good intentions, but they didn't always keep up with how fast tech changes.
Makes sense. So we need a more adaptable approach. Can you give me some examples of the kind of problems we're talking about? Concrete examples, maybe?
Sure. The report talks about GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and how they're regulated in the EU. They have this process-based approach. So they're really focused on how a GMO is created rather than the actual characteristics of the end product.
So they're more concerned with the how rather than the what.
Exactly. And the report, it argues that this approach, while it's well-intentioned, it might have actually slowed down innovation in the EU compared to, say, the US. They have more of a product-based approach. They focus on the safety and efficacy of the actual product, regardless of how it was made.
Interesting. So being too focused on the process, rather than the outcome can sometimes actually hinder innovation. Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us back to PAGIT. What's the solution? What does it propose?
Well, PAGIT is all about finding a way to govern innovation that is more proportionate, more adaptive. Yeah. It's about recognizing that we need a system that can keep up with how fast technology is changing, but still making sure things are developed responsibly.
I'm digging this. Okay, so tell me, what are the big ideas behind PAGIT? What are the principles?
It's built around four main principles, actually: proportionality, adaptation, responsibility, and balance.
Yeah.
And these principles work together to help make sure that new products and services that they benefit society, while also meeting high standards for things like safety, quality, and efficacy.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Let's break those down. Let's start with proportionality. What does that even mean, in this context?
Proportionality means that the level of regulation should kind of match the level of risk a tech poses. So, we don't want to over-regulate something that's pretty low risk, but we also don't want to under-regulate something that could cause a lot of harm.
Right. It's about finding the sweet spot, not using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Exactly. Then there's adaptation, which is all about making sure that that our governance frameworks can keep up with technology. It's changing so fast. So this means being flexible and being willing to adjust the regulations as we get new information. As technologies change, the regulations got to change too.
So no more set it and forget it type regulations.
Nope. No way. You got to be agile, especially in the world of new tech. Next is responsibility, which means that innovators need to develop and deploy technologies in a way that's ethical, a way that aligns with societal values.
Right. It's not just about making cool tech, but also about making sure that it's used for good, that it's beneficial. I dig that.
Yep. And finally, there's balance. This principle is really about finding that sweet spot between, on the one hand, you want to encourage innovation, but on the other hand, you need to address the concerns people might have about, safety or ethics or just the impact of these technologies.
Sounds like walking a tightrope. Okay, so we've got the principles. How do we actually use this PAGIT framework, like in the real world? Does the report give us any practical guidance?
It does. It introduces this model called STRATUS, which stands for Strategic Analysis of Advanced Technology Innovation Systems. STRATUS helps us understand things from the innovator's perspective, which I think is really key if we're going to build a governance system that actually works.
So we're getting into the heads of the people who are creating these technologies. That's fascinating. Tell me more about STRATUS.
Well, STRATUS highlights several factors that influence innovation, but for this deep dive, we're going to focus on just two: business models and technology readiness levels.
Okay, I'm familiar with business models, but technology readiness levels, that sounds pretty technical.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Technology readiness levels, or TRLs, are just a way to measure how far along a technology is in its development. It's a scale from 1 to 9. 1 is the very earliest research, very basic.
Yeah.
And then 9 represents a technology that's fully developed, ready for commercial use.
So it's like tracing a tech's journey, from the lab all the way to the store shelves.
Yeah, exactly. And the PAGIT framework, it's really focused on TRLs 3 through 9 because it recognizes that even in those early stages, it's important to start thinking about how we're going to govern this stuff.
Makes sense. So how do business models and TRLs tie into the governance question? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. Let's take industrial biotechnology as an example.
Yeah.
So this is a field where they use microbes to produce chemicals that are usually made from fossil fuels. So there's it's a really promising tech, potentially game-changing. Could help us create products that are way more sustainable.
Okay, so we've got these scientists in the lab. They're bubbling flasks, and the tiny microbes are working their magic. I can picture it.
Now imagine all the companies that are involved in bringing a product to market, right? A product that's made using industrial biotechnology. You've got the synthetic biology companies. They're the ones engineering the microbes. Then there's the specialty chemical manufacturers. They produce the chemicals at scale. Then you've got the formulators. They use the chemicals to make products like soap or detergent or whatever. And then finally the retailers. They're the ones selling it to us, to consumers.
So a whole chain of companies all playing a different role. But how does that relate to PAGIT and this idea of proportionate and adaptive governance?
Well, for some companies in that chain, industrial biotech, it would be seriously disruptive, like those synthetic bio companies, the chemical manufacturers. They would have to completely rethink their business, how they do things to adapt to this new way of making things.
It would be an adapt or die situation, kind of.
Exactly. But then for companies further down the chain, like the formulators or the retailers, it might not be as big a deal, maybe more of an incremental change for them. They're still using chemicals, just chemicals that are made in a different way, more sustainable way.
Ah, I see. So the level of disruption, it depends on where a company sits in that value chain. That's a really important thing for policymakers to understand.
It is. And it really shows how understanding both business models and TRLs can help us make, smarter governance decisions, more effective decisions.
This is where it starts to get really interesting. I love how PAGIT really encourages us to think ahead, anticipate those ripple effects and make sure our approach to governance is tailored to the specific situation.
That's the beauty of it. Yeah. It's designed for a world where tech is always changing and evolving so rapidly.
Now, before we get too far into the weeds here, I want to take a minute to define some terms. We've been talking about disruptive innovation, but what does that really mean? And how is it different from incremental innovation?
Yeah, good point. Those terms get thrown around a lot. Incremental innovation, it's basically about making small improvements to products or processes that already exist. It's like upgrading your phone to the newest model.
Okay.
It's better, faster, fancier, but it's still basically the same tech.
Got it. So it's evolution, not revolution.
Right. But disruptive innovations, those are the game changers. They introduce something totally new that totally changes how we do things.
Right. Okay, give me an example, like a classic example of a disruptive innovation.
Think about the first iPhone. It wasn't just a slightly better cell phone. It completely changed how we interacted with technology, how we communicated, how we consume media. It was a total paradigm shift.
Yeah, the iPhone definitely disrupted a lot of industries. Now the report mentions another example, right? Something about comparing genetically modified crops to Google's search engine.
Yes, it uses that comparison to highlight the difference between disruptive and incremental innovation.
Yeah.
Genetically modified crops, they were a big deal, but they were still tied to the existing agricultural system.
Yeah.
Google search engine, that was something else entirely. It created a whole new market, a new way to access information, a new way to navigate the digital world.
Yeah, it's wild to think how Google went from being like a college project to this global behemoth that basically changed how we find information. Okay, so let's bring it back to the PAGIT framework. How does this distinction between disruptive and incremental innovation, how does that actually matter when we're talking about governance?
That's where the framework really shines. It
Right.
helps regulators and policymakers. It guides them through a series of considerations that are based on the TRL of the innovation, because it recognizes the different stages of development that might need different governance approaches.
So it's like a roadmap for governing innovation at every stage, from the early research all the way to the final product being on the market.
Exactly. The framework, it breaks it down into stages that correspond to those TRLs we talked about, and it helps us ask the right questions at each stage, making sure that the way we govern keeps pace with the tech itself.
I'm really liking this structured approach. Okay, walk me through it. What happens at each of these stages?
So the first stage, TRLs 1 to 3, the framework calls it the pre-regulatory analysis stage. This is when an innovation is still in its early stages, maybe just an idea, a glimmer in a researcher's eye.
So the very beginning, when an innovation is just a seed of an idea.
Right. Even at this early stage, the PAGIT framework encourages us to start thinking about governance. It doesn't mean, we start regulating right away, but it does mean asking some key questions.
Give me an example of the kind of questions we should be asking.
Well, at this point, regulators and innovators, they might start thinking about what existing regulations might already apply, or whether they might need new ones down the line, and how they might be able to steer the development of the tech in a direction that's responsible, that aligns with societal values. Remember, responsible innovation is important right from the very beginning.
So it's about foresight, planning, thinking ahead, but not about stifling those early ideas with too many rules.
Got it. What happens next?
The next stage, TRLs 4 and 5, is all about it's about pre-regulatory standards and guidelines.
Okay, so now we're moving beyond the brainstorming phase. Things are starting to take shape. What kind of standards are we talking about?
These are usually voluntary guidelines, developed by industry groups or standards organizations. They provide a framework for developing things responsibly, helping innovators to avoid potential pitfalls and to build trust with the public. And this all happens before any formal regulations are put in place.
I can see how that would be super valuable for disruptive innovations, because they're often operating in areas where there aren't any existing regulations to fall back on. Exactly. Standards and guidelines,
Right.
They can provide much needed guidance, especially in those early stages. Help make sure innovation happens responsibly, and they can even lay the groundwork for future regulations. If those become necessary. By establishing best practices, common terminology.
So it's like setting the stage for success for both the innovators and for society as a whole.
Exactly. And then we get to a really crucial point, TRL 6 and 7. This is what the framework calls the regulatory decision point.
Decisions. This sounds important. What's happening here?
So at this stage, we know enough about the technology to decide whether we need stricter regulations.
Yeah.
or whether those pre-regulatory standards and guidelines we were just talking about, whether those are, whether those are enough. It's a key moment where regulators have to decide whether to, to step in with formal rules or to keep relying on those more flexible, voluntary approaches.
I can see why they call it a decision point. What are the factors that go into making that decision?
Well, regulators, they're gonna look at the potential risks and benefits of the check, of course.
Yeah.
How disruptive it is, what the existing, governance landscape looks like, and they'll also look at, how effective those pre-regulatory standards and guidelines have been. Has they been working, or are there gaps that need to be filled with more formal regulations?
So it's not a simple yes or no decision. It's about choosing the best approach, the most appropriate approach for the specific technology. And even if formal regulations are introduced, the PAGIT framework, it still emphasizes those standards and guidelines. Right?
Absolutely. Even in the later stages, when when a product is close to being commercialized, or maybe it's already on the market, those standards and guidelines, they still play a really, really important role.
That makes sense. The tech world is always changing, so you need those guidelines to be adaptable, to keep up with with the pace of change.
Exactly. TRLs 8 and 9, which the framework calls post-regulatory standards and guidelines. That stage is all about ongoing monitoring and adaptation. So even after a product is out there, new info might come out, new risks, new benefits might emerge. The tech itself might evolve in ways we didn't expect. Those post-regulatory standards, those guidelines, they allow for flexibility, responsiveness, to make sure governance is still relevant, still effective.
It's like a dance, between pushing the boundaries and making sure we're doing it responsibly. I love that.
It's definitely a dynamic process. Requires collaboration, communication between innovators, regulators, and the public.
Speaking of collaboration, the PG framework also it emphasizes this distinction between product-based and process-based regulation, right?
Right. It does. Yes, and that's a distinction that can have a huge impact on innovation.
Right. We talked about this a little bit earlier with the GMO regulations in the EU. Can you remind me why this distinction matters so much?
It's all about, are we regulating the technology itself, or are we regulating the specific products that are created using that technology? Remember how the EU regulates GMOs? They're focused on the process of genetic modification, not the actual end product.
Yeah, that's the process-based approach. And the report argues that it hasn't really been a recipe for success when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, that's right. A process-based approach, it can be overly cautious. It can stifle innovation because it's focused on the how, not the what. PAGIT, it argues for a more product-based approach. So focus on the end product, the characteristics of the end product, regardless of the technology that was used to create it.
It's like judging a cake by how it tastes, not by the the recipe or the oven that was used.
Exactly. And the report it uses the GMO example to show how that process-based approach in the EU has led to a much more cautious environment compared to the U.S., where they've embraced that product-based approach. They're looking at the safety, the efficacy of the end product.
So the takeaway is, don't get too hung up on the process. You got to focus on the product, the outcome, and tailor the way we govern to that specific product.
Right. Now, to really see how these principles play out in the real world, the report looks at some really interesting case studies.
Okay, let's dive into those case studies. I'm always up for some real world examples.
So one case study, I thought this one was really, really interesting. It looks at the UK's Regulatory Horizons Council, the RHC. They had this big task, figuring out how to make the UK a global leader in genetic technologies, while also, making sure those technologies are developed safely and responsibly.
So we're back to GMOs and gene editing, but now we're seeing how the UK is tackling it.
Yeah. And the RHC, they were wrestling with this challenge, right? How do you create an environment, a regulatory environment that really allows for innovation in this field that's changing so fast, while also at the same time addressing the concerns that people have, legitimate concerns about genetic modification.
Sounds like a tough balancing act. So how did the PAGIT framework help them?
Well, remember how PAGIT emphasizes that product-based approach?
Judge the cake, not the oven.
Exactly. So the REC, they took that to heart, and they recommended that the UK move away from that process-based approach that the EU's been using, and instead adopt a system that's more proportionate, more adaptive, a product-based regulatory system for genetic technologies.
So a pretty big shift in how they're thinking about it. Did they give any specific examples of how that might work in practice?
They did. They proposed this regulatory pathway that focuses on identifying and addressing the potential hazards from genetic changes in a product, right?
Right.
Regardless of how those changes were actually made. So it's really about evaluating that final product, not getting caught up in the the details of how it was created.
Sounds like they're really trying to find that sweet spot, between encouraging innovation but also making sure things are safe. Did they talk about public trust at all? Because that seems really important when you're dealing with, genetic technologies.
They did, yeah. They knew that genetic technologies, people have a lot of sometimes concerns about them, sometimes even opposition. So they recommended that the UK, that they set up a stakeholder advisory panel to make sure that these technologies are developed in a way that people are comfortable with, a way that aligns with societal values.
That's a great idea. Getting everyone to the table to have, those conversations, open and honest conversations about what these technologies mean for all of us.
Right. All about building trust, being transparent, making sure that innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum, that it's responsive to what people are thinking and feeling.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see how this PAGIT framework, it's like a toolkit. It can be used for all sorts of innovations, not just the life sciences stuff.
Exactly. And to show how versatile it is. The report also looks at how PAGIT can be applied to a totally different field, quantum technologies. Quantum. Now we're talking cutting edge. I'm all ears.
Yeah, all right.
What are the challenges of governing something like quantum technologies?
Well, quantum tech it's still pretty early days, right? But it has the potential to totally revolutionize so many things. Computing, communications, medicine, materials science. But with all that potential, there are definitely some governance challenges.
I can imagine. It's like we're talking about tech that operates at the the subatomic level.
Yeah.
Harnessing the strangeness of quantum mechanics. It's got to be really hard to even wrap your head around the potential risks and benefits, let alone figure out how to regulate it all.
Yeah, no kidding. But the report, it found that even in a field as complex as quantum, a field that's changing so fast, the PAGIT framework is still it's still really helpful. It gives us a way to think about these challenges and come up with solutions. So those PAGIT principles, like proportionality, adaptation, responsibility, balance, they're still relevant even when we're talking about tech that feels almost like science fiction.
Absolutely. They are. And the report, it really stresses that, just like with genetic technologies, that product-based approach, it's crucial. We need to be looking at the specific applications, of quantum tech rather than trying to regulate the underlying science itself.
Right, because quantum science it's huge and it's complicated. It'd be like trying to herd cats.
Exactly. And the report, it also highlights the importance of standards and guidelines, especially in those those early stages, because they can provide a framework for responsible innovation, while also allowing for flexibility as the technology develops and matures.
Standards and guidelines always there to guide us through the chaos of new technologies.
Exactly. So one really interesting thing about the quantum report is that it really focuses on foresight. They recommend that regulators and innovators, they work together to try to anticipate what the governance needs might be, for these technologies, even for ones that are years away from becoming a reality, from being commercially available.
So it's like peering into a crystal ball, trying to see the future and figure out what kind of governance structures we might need to make sure these technologies are used responsibly, ethically.
Exactly. And the report, it suggests that the PAGIT framework can be a really valuable tool for doing that, for that kind of foresight work. It helps us ask the right questions, identify potential problems before they actually become problems.
Yeah.
And proactively, try to shape a future where these technologies are used for good.
This is really making me think about the long term. It's not just about about solving today's problems. It's about
Got it.
anticipating the challenges of tomorrow and making sure that that technology, that it serves us, that it doesn't end up controlling us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The PAGIT framework, it encourages us to see governance not as a set of rules, set in stone, but as a process, a dynamic process, something that evolves along with technology.
It's like we're building the plane as we fly it, but in a responsible way, of course.
Exactly. We had to be proactive, adaptable, and always talking to each other, regulators, the innovators, the public.
Now, beyond those high-profile cases, the gene editing, the quantum stuff, the report also looks at a more nuanced example, the production of high-value chemical intermediates using industrial biotechnology.
Right. This case study, it's a really good example of how PAGI can help us understand the different levels of disruption and innovation can have, across different parts of the value chain. Remember we were talking about those synthetic bio companies, the chemical manufacturers, and how for some of them, the shift to industrial biotech could be, really, really disruptive. While for others, it's more incremental.
Yeah, like some companies are hit by a tsunami, while others just feel a little ripple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this case study, it goes deeper into those dynamics, looks at how that shift to bio-based chemicals, how it might shake things up for some companies while others can adapt more gradually. And it shows how the PAGI framework can help policymakers, regulators anticipate those different levels of disruption and tailor their approach accordingly.
So they can focus on supporting the companies that are facing, the biggest changes, the most disruptive changes, while also, making sure that the existing regulations are flexible enough to accommodate these new technologies.
Exactly. It's all about understanding understanding how the pieces fit together, the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And finding that balance between, encouraging innovation, but also making sure we're not causing any unintended harm.
And speaking of balance, the report, it also looks at a case study that examines responsible innovation from a value chain perspective.
Yes. That case study focuses on the development of single-celled protein for animal feed.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how important it is to think about responsible innovation all along the value chain, from the early research and development stages all the way to production, distribution, and even consumption.
So it's not just the innovator's responsibility then, it's the manufacturers, the distributors, even the consumers, they all have a role to play in making sure that these technologies are used ethically and sustainably.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility. We all have to work together if we want innovation to benefit everyone.
I'm really seeing how this PAGIT framework it's not just, some abstract idea. It's a practical guide for navigating this whole world of emerging technologies, asking the right questions, anticipating challenges, finding solutions that balance progress with responsibility.
Couldn't agree more. PAGIT, it gives us a roadmap to make sure that these amazing technologies reach their full potential, but also that we're protecting society, protecting the planet.
It's like we're all in this together, figuring out how to shape the future in a way that works for everyone.
That's the key takeaway. Now, to help companies with all this, to help them navigate this world of responsible innovation, the report, it highlights a really, really useful tool, the BSI PAS 440 standard on responsible innovation.
Okay, break that down for me. What is PAS 440 and how does it fit into all of this?
PAS 440.
Okay.
So, is it like a set of rules or more like guidelines for companies?
Think of it like a guidebook, a practical guidebook for building responsibility into how a company does business. It's not, it's not a bunch of hard and fast rules. It's more like a framework, to help them think about innovation in a way that takes into account the bigger picture, how it affects society, environment, even human health.
So it's like a roadmap for companies that want to create these world-changing technologies, but also be good global citizens, right? Yeah, exactly. It helps them to identify those potential benefits and risks early on, and to engage with stakeholders, to have those conversations, and ultimately to make sure that the things they're creating, that they align with what society wants and expects.
That all sounds very, very responsible, very forward thinking. But I guess my question is, wouldn't Wouldn't any ethical company, wouldn't they already be doing that kind of stuff anyway? What makes PAS 440? What makes it special?
I think it's about going beyond, just being a responsible company
Yeah.
in a general sense. PS 440 it recognizes that innovation, especially when we're talking about disruptive innovation,
Yeah.
that demands a different level of attention. You got to be more proactive,
Yeah.
more thoughtful in your approach.
Right.
It's not just about complying with the rules. It's about actively shaping a future where innovation is a force for good.
It's a call to action almost for companies to really step up and be leaders in responsible innovation. I like that.
Yeah, and one thing that I think really sets PS 440 apart is that it makes this distinction, right, between the things a company does to be responsible in general, company-wide,
Mm.
and the things they do specifically for innovation. Because
Mhm.
innovation, it often takes us into uncharted territory where the risks and the benefits, they're not always clear. So you need to be extra careful, extra thoughtful.
That makes sense. It's like acknowledging that innovation, it's not business as usual, right? You gotta think differently, be more deliberate in how you approach it.
Yeah, you got to recognize that innovation, it comes with its own set of responsibilities.
Okay, so you mentioned that PS 440, it offers some practical advice, some tools. Can you give me some examples? Like what does that look like?
Sure. One of the key tools is this framework for assessing the potential impacts of an innovation, both the good and the bad. So it helps companies think about the societal impacts, the environmental impacts, the health impacts. It helps them spot those potential pitfalls and opportunities too, early on.
So it's like a risk-benefit analysis, but it's more than that. It's not just about profits and losses, right? It's about thinking about the impact on the world, on society.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond, just the company's bottom line and thinking about those long-term consequences. And to help with that, PS 440, it actually gives companies a template, They can
Yeah.
use it to systematically assess these potential impacts and develop strategies for dealing with them, try to minimize the negative impacts and really, really maximize those positive impacts.
Sounds like a really helpful tool. It's like having a framework for those what if scenarios,
Yeah.
which seems really, really crucial when you're dealing with these new technologies that have the potential to to change so much.
Exactly. And beyond just identifying those potential impacts, PS 440 also, it provides guidance on how to engage with
Yeah.
stakeholders, how to have those conversations, in a way that's meaningful, it's productive. It's about being open and transparent, listening to different perspectives, addressing concerns in a way that's respectable, responsive.
Which is so important, right? Especially when you're dealing with innovations that, that could be controversial, that could really disrupt things. You need to build trust. You need to have those conversations, make sure people feel like they're being heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And to help with that, to help companies, navigate those conversations, PS 440, it has some specific guidelines for stakeholder engagement. It talks about things like making sure everyone's treated fairly, thinking carefully about the timing of those conversations and making sure that both sides are considered, the potential benefits and the potential risks.
So it's not just about, about talking to stakeholders. It's about talking with them
You're right.
in a way that's genuine, that takes their perspectives into account.
Exactly. It's about building relationships,
Yeah.
not just checking a box.
No, you mentioned earlier that this whole PAGIT framework, with its focus on responsible innovation, it's been pretty influential here in the UK. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like how have these ideas actually been put into practice? How are they showing up in policies and in real world actions?
It's been really great to see. The UK government, they've really embraced these principles of responsible innovation. They're really committed to creating an environment where innovation can thrive, but also making sure that it's done in a way that benefits everyone, that aligns with the values, the values of society.
So they're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. What are some concrete examples?
Well, the Regulatory Horizons Council,
Yeah.
what we've been talking about, the gene editing, the quantum stuff, that's a great example. The RHC, their whole job is to identify and address those regulatory challenges that come with new technologies. And they use a framework that's heavily inspired by PAGIT.
That's really cool because it's one thing to talk about these ideas, but it's another thing to actually see them being used, by a government agency that's actually shaping policy.
Yeah, it's really encouraging, right, to see it all coming together. And beyond the RHC, the UK government, they've also launched all sorts of initiatives and programs to support responsible innovation across all kinds of different industries. They get it. They know that fostering this culture of responsibility it's not just the right thing to do, it's also good for business. It helps build trust.
Yeah.
It helps make sure that these technologies are used in a way that benefits everyone.
It's like they're creating this whole ecosystem, for responsible innovation, where it's not just about the ideas, but it's also about providing that support, the incentives for companies to actually do it, to actually put these principles into practice.
Exactly. It takes a village, right? It takes everyone working together.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground, from those core principles of PAGIT and all the nuances of disruptive innovation to the importance of stakeholder engagement and these standards like PAS 440.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
And I think the big takeaway for our listeners is that governance, it doesn't have to be this obstacle. It doesn't have to be something that gets in the way of innovation. Actually, when it's done right, it can actually help, help make sure that these incredible new technologies are used to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So as we wrap things up here, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about. As we head deeper into the 21st century, a century that's going to be, dominated by technology, by these incredible advances, do you think frameworks like PAGIT, do you think tools like PAS 440, do you think those are going to become even more important, even more crucial?
That's a really great question, and I think it's something we all need to think about as we try to figure out how to live with these powerful technologies, how to make sure they're used wisely.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for being such a great guide on this deep dive. It's been really fun exploring these ideas with you.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to get into these big questions.
And to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. Keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.